maybe let's spend a couple minutes talking about like what did happen in 1971. Why is that significant, and what is being what's tying all these charts together?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough question to say what happened in 1971. You kind of have to go back, and again, Bitcoin is a new monetary technology, and previous to that, we had different monetary technologies. So, in order to understand what exactly happened in 1971, you really have to go back a lot further. To understand what a gold standard really was such that we had these pieces of paper that were certificates that literally said this is worth X weight of gold. This piece of paper is worth exactly this much gold. And that was, in the 1800s, and all sorts of banks could issue these. And sometimes those banks would fail. And every time the bank failed, it was because there ended up being more paper floating around than there was gold. Lynn Alden started talking about this recently, but I've been talking about it for a while. And it's a really important concept to understand of how and why gold failed. When we as a civilization started to be able to move around information more quickly than we can move around the base layer currency, the gold, then we ended up needing a new monetary technology to scale the gold to move it around. And, when I use the word paper money, paper certificates kind of fall into this. Paper fiat money that aren't certificates fall into this. And I also count digital paper money. So these are all technologies that helped scale gold and eventually got us off of gold because the paper ended up not matching the gold. And you saw this happen so many times. I mean, there were pure fiat currencies, in the 1800s, there were experiments with that. Those all failed. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about paper that was supposed to be represented gold. And if you go back to all these bank failures in the 1800s, eventually you kind of get to the 1913 when we established the Federal Reserve to end this pesky problem of bank failures, right? Because all you really need is a lender of last resort to step in and bail out the banks and capitalize them when there's one of these bank runs, essentially, right? That was the premise. And that leads you to 1929, when now that all the risk was taken out of the system, you ended up with a bunch of over-leveraged banks, and then there was systemic collapse. So this is the idea of you hear Bitcoiners talk about we have these forest fires that clear out the brush, right? And if you always constantly put out every single forest fire, then a massive one can come along because that underbrush isn't cleared out. Well, that's kind of what happened in 1929. This massive forest fire just ripped through everything. And that essentially it was the first real big systemic default of gold. In 1933, with FDR, the New Deal, there was a period of a lot of crazy economic things that happened. Currencies were kind of all now inflating, and there was this quasi fiat bimetallism weird era. And then you get to 1944, and then you had the Bretton Woods system. So that was a long, I have to bring you all the way up to 1971, right? So the Bretton Woods system now was this now new quasi gold standard where these paper notes were now kind of back to being certificates for gold, for a weight of gold, a specific weight of gold. So that sounds like it's good, right? But there was a key difference to previous gold standards, was that you could not redeem, an individual could not go to the bank and redeem these for gold, right? You could buy, and actually you couldn't buy gold either. Gold was outlawed in bullion form. So from 1944 to 1971, there was this quasi gold standard where every other country would redeem their currencies for dollars, and dollars could be redeemed for gold. So that was the gold standards, that the dollar is the center of this system, and the U.S. had the most gold at the time, and we were very trustworthy, right? So it kind of worked well for a while, and people think that under this gold standard that debasement didn't really happen, but it was more just that kind of all the countries were debasing at the same rate. But the United States had this exorbitant privilege where everybody needed their dollars. Specifically because it's at the center of this Bretton Woods system, and it became the world reserve currency because of that. And we were able to kind of take even more advantage of this than every other country. And eventually we started losing all the gold. And the reason is because people figured out the game, and they started redeeming the paper. There was more paper than there was gold for the gold. And there's a chart on our website about halfway down to this green area where you can see the gold is we are losing all of it, right? It's literally leaving the country because it's being redeemed. And Nixon had to step in. So Nixon, you know, I love making fun of Nixon. Don't get me wrong. Like, listen, this guy, you know, I am not a crook, right? But it's really, to say that it was Nixon's fault is really missing the point. And in 1971, what happened was he was left with bad options on every single side. And the option he ended up taking was to temporarily suspend the redeemability of dollars into gold. He came on TV and he said this. And that temporarily was 51 years ago almost now. And it's not temporary, it's permanent. This ostensibly put the entire world on a fiat system. It removed gold from the equation completely. And it made fiat money work, huge quotations there, because it was this 3-card Monte where the paper that we were using for money was ostensibly tied to gold until it wasn't, right? So it had this gold backing and it was just ripped away. And because everybody else's currency wasn't tied to gold, they were tied to the dollar and the dollar was tied to gold. Anyway, long story short, this event put the entire world system in the hands of governments, could now control the money supply unabated. They had no tie to reality. They had nothing stopping them from emitting more money. And now controlling all sorts of other things, like interest rates. And I think objectively, you know, if you just kind of sit back, that puts us into a paradigm where there's the ability for more interventionism. And I think in general, interventionism is very bad for markets, for value discovery, for, you know, price discovery, etc. And I think it has been objectively worse. I think the ways that society is better is because of deflation, and we've had much more inflation since then. And now we have the problem of too much debt, right, P? So that's only part of what happened in 1971.